and we thank you for choosing to share this hour with us at Audio Journal. We'll see you next week. Enjoy this sunny, wonderful day.
More great programming is on its way to you from your friends at Audio Journal. Would you like to know just what's on when? You can call 508-797-1117 and request a program guide in a format that works best for you. Either large print, braille, or recorded versions are available. Or you can always visit our fully accessible website, www.audiojournal.net. That's also the location for you to hear our programs at your convenience. Listen online anytime. We stream live or have most programs archived for listening to fit your schedule. Check out www.audiojournal.net.
This is BirdNote. The song of a Swainson's thrush spirals upward as we begin a hike in the mountains of the West. The trail leads from a riverside forest in the lowlands, and as we walk, bird voices ring out. A mile up the trail, in a stand of ponderosa pines, a Townsend solitaire lets loose its rush of notes. Another mile along, and among silvery green fir trees, the crystalline phrases of a hermit thrush carry through the forest. A pine grosbeak warbles sweetly from the scattered evergreens as our climb reaches the high subalpine. We stop now at the top, in the open, rocky alpine zone, and an American pipit hovers overhead and trills a long torrent of notes. Finally, as we take in the vast, snow-draped mountain landscape, a white-tailed ptarmigan cackles from atop a lichen-covered boulder. Listen again at birdnote.org. I'm Mary McCann.
Well, that was informative. At Audio Journal, we strive to make a difference in your life by providing local news, information, and a bit of entertainment. We'd also like to be a voice from the community we serve. If you have information to share, maybe a helpful service you've heard about, or an upcoming event, let's help each other spread the word. Contact us at 508-797-network.org.
Thank you for listening to the Massachusetts Reading Network, a window to independent life in your community from Cape Cod to the Berkshires.
This is volunteer reader Jeff Van Amber broadcasting from Worcester, Massachusetts. Stay tuned for more coming your way next.
WRRS Middleborough, Pittsfield, WVBF Middleborough, WDJM Framingham, WUML Lowell, WLLO Londonderry.
Please join the Talking Information Center for a presentation of Time Magazine. It's coming up next.
This is Gene reading from Time Magazine's issue of July 23, 2018. The brief opener, Immigration, What's Keeping Migrant Families Apart, by Maya Rodan. The federal government is under court orders to swiftly reunite the migrant families that were separated at the border under the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy. But efforts to get even the youngest children returned to their parents stalled as the administration struggled to reverse a crisis of its own making. In late June, a judge ruled that the 102 children under 5 who had been separated from their parents as a result of the policy needed to be returned to their families by July 10. In the case of those ages 5 and up, at least 2,000 minors, the administration was given until July 26. The first deadline has come and gone, and it was one the federal government could not fully meet. In many cases, the problem was simple, if shocking. The government was ready to release the children, but couldn't yet verify with whom they belonged. At the same time, a little over a quarter of the separated children under 5 could not be reunited because the adults they arrived with were found to have serious criminal histories, or no relation to the children, or because they are currently being held in criminal custody. There is also one child in custody that the Department of Justice said could be a U.S. citizen. Given those factors, the Trump administration was on track to reunite just 55 young children with their parents by or shortly after July 10. It would take longer for at least 20 whose parents had been deported or released in the U.S. A last-minute effort to gain more time was rejected by Dana Sabra, the federal judge overseeing the case. These are firm deadlines, he said. They're not aspirational goals. The policy that triggered the separation was clear enough. Prosecute everyone who crosses the border illegally, which meant taking away the kids who cannot be put in criminal detention with adults. But there were no instructions on how to undo the process. The executive order that President Trump signed on June 20 stopped the separations, but did not fully address how families would be put back together. The problem was not lost on Judge Sabra. There was no reunification plan in place, and families have been separated for months, he wrote in a June 26 order. While he is happy with the progress made, he said that the government has an obligation to reunite as quickly as possible the families it separated. Trump offered a different take on the missed deadline on July 10. I have a solution. Tell people not to come to our country illegally. Sabra has called for regular updates from the feds and the American Civil Liberties Union, which brought the suit to him as the reunification process continues. Government officials have insisted that they know the whereabouts of every child in their custody and have worked to keep parents and children in contact. But their priority is to see that families are reunited in a manner that ensures the safety of the child, which can take time. In order to gain custody of an unaccompanied minor in the care of the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement, adults typically have to undergo a comprehensive vetting process that involves everything from submitting fingerprints to demonstrating financial stability. Now those well-intentioned hurdles are being set aside for families who were separated at the border. The government has indicated that it will take steps to streamline reunifications, which have to be completed before the month ends. In some cases, for example, they will use DNA tests to guarantee parental relationships they cannot otherwise confirm. Judge Sabra said samples must be destroyed after the relationships are established. But that acceleration doesn't erase the trauma that came with separation. And reunification is only step one for the families in question. They still have to face the rest of the immigration process. Only now they'll do it as a unit rather than separately. Zero tolerance had been among many Trump administration efforts to crack down on illegal immigration, and some officials had specifically pitched family separations as a possible deterrent for border crossings. To an extent, they succeeded. Apprehensions fell by 18% between May and June, according to recent data. But in the court of public opinion, the administration's harsh posture toward migrants has been widely condemned. It also has not had much luck in federal courtrooms. federal officials had sought to modify a long-standing legal settlement that limited the amount of time children can be held in immigration detention. But another federal judge rejected that request, too. On the very night of the first reunification deadline, the Trump administration announced that rather than being held in detention, migrant families would be released from custody wearing electronic monitors, essentially returning U.S. border policy to the way it was before zero tolerance started. The setback for Trump and his immigration team has left them where they began. That's more than can be said of the nearly 2,000 separated children who are still in custody. In the Nation, Trump's Justice: How Brett Kavanaugh Could Change America, by Brian Bennett. President Trump had narrowed his list of contenders for the nation's highest court to 4 by the time Air Force One touched down outside Washington on July 8. But Trump wanted another sit-down with one candidate in particular. That evening at the White House, Trump spent more than an hour in his private residence talking with Brett Kavanaugh about the judge's family, his life growing up in the Capitol with 2 lawyers as parents, and his work, according to a person familiar with the discussion. It was the longest amount of time Trump had spent with any of the candidates. After their discussion, Trump said Kavanaugh was a judge out of central casting, one of the president's favorite compliments. The meeting led directly to the East Room of the White House the following night, where Trump announced Kavanaugh's nomination beneath gleaming chandeliers. There, Kavanaugh needed only 14 words to describe his approach to the bench. A judge must be independent and must interpret the law, not make the law. That simple sentence was more than just a judicial philosophy. It reflected the culmination of 2 distinct efforts at judicial mentoring, which came together in Kavanaugh's nomination. One was the 4-decade effort by an entire generation of conservatives to bend the court away from judicial activism. The other was a patient education and corralling of Trump by a handful of Republican legal elites. The intrigue surrounding the selection was, of course, classic Trump, from an interview process that resembled a matchmaking show to the pageantry of the primetime announcement. But the choice will have far-reaching consequences for America's 325 million citizens. If confirmed, Kavanaugh, 53, could solidify a conservative majority on the court for decades. During his 12 years on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, he has issued some 300 opinions that reflect his reputation on both sides of the aisle as a solid and careful judge. Democrats warn that his conservative record suggests he will bolster the pro-business leaning on the court, advance efforts to strip power from regulatory agencies, slow the expansion of gay rights, strengthen gun rights, and open the door for states to chip away at access to abortions. No single justice steers the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh's influence will take years to measure and depends on which cases come before him. Protests from Democrats that Kavanaugh would help overturn the seminal abortion decision Roe v. Wade ignore the court's deference to precedent. Kavanaugh himself said during his 206 confirmation hearings for the lower court that Roe was already decided, although Supreme Court justices can chart a new direction in ways lower courts cannot. But there is little question that his conservative jurisprudence would have a major impact, given Kavanaugh's intellect, work ethic, and reputation for clarity in his opinions. That body of writing persuaded Trump and his conservative advisers that Kavanaugh would remain a stalwart originalist on the bench. Some observers wonder if Trump may have fixated on one point of view in particular. Kavanaugh, who was part of independent counsel Kenneth Starr's investigation of President Bill Clinton, and later served more than 5 years in President George W. Bush's White House, is an ardent believer in executive power. In a 2009 Law Review article, he called for Congress to pass a law stating that sitting presidents should not be subject to criminal investigations or civil suits while in office, adding that the Constitution prescribes the impeachment process as the remedy for ousting a wayward president. That view has obvious implications for Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Trump's ties to Russia during the 2016 campaign. If the justices are asked to decide whether Trump can be subpoenaed or charged with a crime in office, it's clear where Kavanaugh is likely to stand. Kavanaugh's path to the East Room accelerated in November 2017 when his name was added to Trump's public list of prospective Supreme Court nominees. The judges were vetted by Leonard Leo, Executive Vice President of the Conservative Federalist Society and Trump's top outside legal advisor. The arrangement was clear. Trump would cede considerable power to shape the court to the conservative legal establishment, and in doing so cement his support from the Republicans, who were otherwise skeptical of a politician who once proclaimed his belief in abortion rights. Former White House strategist Stephen Bannon took to calling this transaction the process, and the selection of Kavanaugh, like conservative Justice Neil Gorsuch last year, shows the process is working, Bannon tells Time. Even more than Gorsuch, whose mother once ran the Environmental Protection Agency, Kavanaugh is a creature of Washington. He was born to two parents who brought their legal lessons to the family dinner table. Kavanaugh's mother was one of D.C.'s few female prosecutors at the time, and later became a judge. When Kavanaugh joined the bench more than a decade later, he hung a framed copy of her investiture documents on the wall next to his desk. Like Gorsuch, Kavanaugh attended Georgetown Preparatory School, a rigorous Jesuit school. He earned degrees from Yale College and Yale Law School and clerked for Justice Anthony Kennedy alongside Gorsuch before joining Starr's investigation into Clinton. Kavanaugh helped write the final Starr report, which recommended Clinton's impeachment for lying about his sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky. When the presidential race between Al Gore and George W. Bush deadlocked in 2000, Kavanaugh joined the GOP legal team, demanding an end to the Florida recount. Less than a year later, he was working inside the Bush White House alongside his now wife, Ashley, when jetliners struck the Twin Towers and the Pentagon on September 11, 2001. The two had had their first date the day before. Kavanaugh served in the White House's counsel's office and as Bush's staff secretary, a demanding job requiring meticulous close reading of every document that crosses the president's desk. In 2003, Bush nominated Kavanaugh for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, but Senate Democrats opposed him for a resume that appeared too partisan. He was finally confirmed in a 57-36 vote in 2006. On the court, Kavanaugh developed a reputation as a diligent judge who often combed through dozens of drafts for even routine opinions, says Roman Martinez, who clerked for Kavanaugh in 2008 and 2009, and recalls a boss who wanted memos and briefs to be accompanied by thick black binders filled with every law review article on the topic. As opinions mounted, the binders stacked up in the kitchenette in Kavanaugh's chambers. Kavanaugh is one of the most serious judges I've ever encountered. He's a much more disciplined judge than the man he's replacing, says Lawrence Silberman, a senior judge on the D.C. Circuit, echoing criticism of Kennedy's sometimes unpredictable arguments. Kavanaugh's rulings reflect skepticism that government agencies have the power to issue regulations that stretch beyond what Congress has passed. He looked askance at several Obama-era environmental protections, including attempts to limit air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, and dissented in a 2015 decision upholding a regulation that required religious organizations to notify the government they were not providing or paying for contraceptives under the Affordable Care Act. Kavanaugh argued that filing the form would make the organization complicit and violate religious freedom rights. On gun rights, Kavanaugh has taken a broad reading of the Second Amendment, writing in a 2011 dissent that the District of Columbia should not be allowed to ban semi-automatic rifles and high-capacity magazines. Kavanaugh argued it was unconstitutional because similar weapons are commonly used in the U.S. As someone who grew up in Washington in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, I am acutely aware of the gun, drug, and gang violence that has plagued all of us, Kavanaugh wrote. But our task is to apply the Constitution and the precedents of the Supreme Court, regardless of whether the result is one we agree with as a matter of first principles or policy. Concerns that Kavanaugh may help chip away at reproductive rights stem largely from a 2017 case in which an undocumented teenager at a Texas detention center sought an abortion after arriving in the U.S. 8 weeks pregnant, and was initially denied one due to the new policies of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which prohibits them without the director's approval. With the help of a guardian, the teenager challenged the policy as an unconstitutional burden. A lower court ruled in the teenager's favor, which the government challenged. The D.C. Circuit ultimately allowed the procedure to go forward, but Kavanaugh dissented, arguing that the majority had created, quote, a new right for unlawful immigrant minors in U.S. government detention to obtain immediate abortion on demand, end quote. A number of cases related to abortion are moving through lower courts, and in the years to come, the Supreme Court may decide to consider, for example, whether a woman can abort a fetus with an abnormality, or where restrictions can be placed on a second trimester abortion procedure. Leah Littman, an assistant professor of constitutional law at the University of California, Irvine, says Kavanaugh's decision in the Texas case portends a jurisprudence that will whittle away at access to abortion for women. That does not necessarily mean that Kavanaugh would help overturn Roe in the event that a case makes its way to the Supreme Court. During his 2006 confirmation hearings, Kavanaugh told senators that Roe has been reaffirmed many times, and he would faithfully and fully follow the decision. That would be binding precedent of the court, he said at the time. It's been decided. Legal scholars and politicos have also been scrutinizing Kavanaugh's expansive interpretation of executive powers. Of all the judges Trump considered, Kavanaugh has the most robust view of presidential powers and immunities, says Jonathan Turley, a constitutional law professor at George Washington University. Indeed, Kavanaugh's 2009 Minnesota Law Review article seems to speak directly to the uncomfortable position in which Trump finds himself, a sitting president under investigation. Kavanaugh said his experience working on Starr's investigation convinced him that presidents should have immunity from all civil and criminal investigations during their tenure. I believe it vital that the president be able to focus on his never-ending tasks with as few distractions as possible, he wrote. The nation certainly would have been better off if President Clinton could have focused on Osama bin Laden without being distracted by the Paula Jones sexual harassment case and its criminal investigation offshoots. In the article, Kavanaugh acknowledges the Supreme Court's 1997 ruling in Clinton v. Jones that the Constitution doesn't give presidents the opportunity to defer federal civil lawsuits during their tenure. But he urges Congress to fix the issue by passing a law allowing presidents to delay civil and criminal investigations, including sit-downs with prosecutors, until they leave the White House. If something drastic happened, he argued, the impeachment process laid out in the Constitution would be sufficient. The point is not to put the president above the law or to eliminate checks on the president, he wrote, but simply to defer litigation and investigations until the president is out of office. The article, written 6 years before Trump announced his bid for the White House, will likely now take center stage during confirmation hearings. The Mueller investigation could force the court to take up a variety of legal questions about the special counsel investigation and its relationship to presidential power, says Richard Pildes, a constitutional law professor at New York University. Those range from a president's ability to pardon himself to his constitutional authority to fire Mueller, to whether Trump could be compelled to testify before a grand jury. Given how carefully potential nominees are vetted by the White House, it seems improbable that President Trump and his advisors aren't aware of Kavanaugh's views of presidential power, says Tara Malloy, a senior director at the Campaign Legal Center. There's no doubt his perspective was taken into consideration. Kavanaugh's long paper trail should reassure conservatives that he's unlikely to fear left should the Senate approve his lifetime appointment. But it also comes with risks, providing fodder for Democrats' campaign against him. The battle to sink the nomination began even before Kavanaugh was put forth. Democratic Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania didn't even wait to learn the nominee's name before announcing that he was a no vote. The party is painting Kavanaugh as skeptical about abortion rights and health care access. Pay close attention to this nomination, Senator Kamala Harris of California warned on the steps of the Supreme Court. If you are a young woman in America, or you care about a young woman in America, pay attention to this, because it will forever change your life. Nan Aaron, president of the Liberal Alliance for Justice, tells Time that Kavanaugh's nomination sets in motion a hard right turn for the country that may be irreversible in our lifetime. Gearing up for a grinding battle, conservatives plan to pour millions of dollars into ad campaigns supporting Kavanaugh and pressuring Senate Democrats who are up for re-election in red states this year to confirm him. Already the conservative Judicial Crisis Network has unleashed a $1.4 million ad campaign in the backyards of Alabama's Doug Jones, Indiana's Joe Donnelly, North Dakota's Heidi Heitkamp, and West Virginia's Joe Manchin. The White House has set up a war room on the 4th floor of the Eisenhower Executive Office Building near the West Wing, with a bank of computers, a large flat-screen television blaring 4 news channels at once, and a room that will be used for practice confirmation hearings. Our strategy is to let him and his record speak for itself, says White House spokesperson Raj Shah, who was running the press operations for the nomination. There's no guarantee that Democrats will hold together, especially if Kavanaugh appears heading to confirmation. Donnelly, Heitkamp, and Manchin, each of whom faced difficult re-election campaigns, all voted for Gorsuch. At the same time, fears among Republicans that GOP senators Susan Collins of Maine or Lisa Murkowski of Alaska might defect over women's health issues, both support abortion rights, seem to fade after Kavanaugh's rollout. which leaves the question of what kind of justice Kavanaugh might be. Some justices have stood out for talking, others by staying silent, a few by corralling others to join their opinions. Kavanaugh seems likeliest to change the court through his dogged conservatism, shaped by his belief that the founders intended for Congress to write the laws, the executive branch to execute them, and judges to draw a bright line between the two. In the world, The Great Escape. Inside the dramatic rescue of a Thai soccer team by Feliz Solomon, Mai Sai. On the afternoon of June 23, Pirapat Sompiengjai's entire family waited for him to come home from soccer practice. Aunts and uncles gathered at the compound in Vieng Hom, a rural village where he and his best friends, Tle, Nick, and Noti, lived and played for the local Wild Boars soccer team. It was his 16th birthday, and a cake was in the refrigerator. As night fell with no word, his parents started making phone calls. For the first few hours, I thought he was fine. I wasn't too concerned, Sri Ward Songpiengjai, his grandfather, told Time. But when Pirapat, who goes by the nickname Knight, didn't come back by morning, the family knew something was very wrong. Word spread that the boys and their coach had gone to a local cave system after practice, and Knight's parents rushed there to try to find their son. Outside, 13 bicycles were propped up by the entrance. A handful of other parents milled around nervously. When we saw the other parents there, Sri Ward said, that's when we really began to worry. The saga of the Wild Boars, the 12 kids and their coach, who found themselves trapped underground as monsoon rains flooded chambers of the cave they were in, gripped the world until the last of the boys was rescued on July 10. After ghostly video footage of them emerged from the cavern where they had found high ground, roughly 1,500 journalists poured into the region to broadcast every twist and turn of the mission to avert tragedy. A global news story quickly became an international rescue effort. More than half a dozen governments threw their weight behind the effort. The U.S. Air Force deployed a survival specialist and an elite special operations unit. Private companies soon followed from France, Israel, the Philippines, and elsewhere. Even Elon Musk, the billionaire founder of SpaceX, offered up a miniature submarine that he thought could be dragged through the jagged tunnels to retrieve the boys. International alliances may fracture, and society may splinter along political and economic lines, but the fate of the Wild Boars offered a powerful galvanizing force. Here was a titanic rescue effort, bound by human determination, that everyone could get behind. But on the ground in Thailand, a happy ending was far from guaranteed. Mai Sai is a sleepy rural district wrapped along Thailand's mountainous border with Myanmar. In the past, it only ever made headlines when drug smugglers were caught hauling opium through a patch of jungle known as the Golden Triangle. Buried in its hills is the sole entrance to Tam Luang, or the Great Cave of the Sleeping Lady, a sprawling 6-mile complex of narrow passageways and deep recesses winding through layers of limestone. Its twists and turns are easy enough to navigate when dry, but sharp and dangerous when water floods the caves during the rainy season. So when provincial authorities arrived on the night of the team's disappearance, almost immediately they knew they needed help. The tunnels were submerged beneath rainwater. The only way to find out if the boys were alive was to call in the military. Among the first responders was Lieutenant Colonel Akarin Thongin, a police force medevac pilot. He was watching TV in his office on June 23 when the news came across the screen that a group of young boys had gone missing. He and 2 other pilots would stand by for days with no one to evacuate. At first, I thought maybe they're trapped inside, but they'll be out by tomorrow, he told Time. I had no idea it would be this complicated. Thai Navy SEALs led the mission and established early on that the most likely place for the team to take shelter was in a chamber more than 2 miles deep called Pattaya Beach, named after the popular tourist destination outside the capital of Bangkok. The amphitheater-like chamber had a surface they hoped would remain above the rising waters, but to get there, divers needed to pass through flooded passageways and chutes as narrow as 2 feet. Rotating teams of 6 dived day and night through the darkness until they came to a dead end, where they felt around blindly for openings. Within days, teams from the U.S., UK, Australia, Japan, China, Laos, and Myanmar had joined the effort. But by the time assistance arrived, the rains had resumed. Days of pumping out water were undone within hours by a second flash flood. The chief of rescue operations, former Governor Narongsak Otsotakorn, later described it as being like a tsunami. Outside the cave, equally chaotic scenes were unfolding. Buddhist monks came every evening to lead the parents in prayer. Many refused to leave the mouth of Than Luang until their sons were freed, sleeping on cots and plastic chairs. Hill tribe shamans trekked from nearby villages to pray and sacrifice live animals. A small tent city quickly sprung up atop 6 inches of mud, with food carts dishing out curry, noodles, energy drinks, and high-protein snacks. A local vocational training school deployed its students to offer free massages to anyone who wanted one. Farmers sacrificed fields to overspill from hundreds of thousands of gallons of water pumped out of the caves hourly. At last, on July 2, a pair of British divers made contact with the boys. A video distributed to the media shows the boys gaunt and huddled on a rocky shelf, with a flashlight scanning each of their faces. One of the divers asks how many are sheltered there. 13, replies the only boy who can speak English. Brilliant, says the diver. The person credited with keeping the boys alive those 10 days in the darkness is their coach, 25-year-old Ekapol Changtawong, or Coach Ek. A stateless member of the Shan minority from Myanmar, Ek was orphaned at the age of 10 and entered the monkhood. The abbot at Prathat Doi Wao Temple, where Coach Ek shares a small room with 2 novices, described him to Time as patient, strong, and very good at meditation. He was said to have collected fresh water, rationed their food, and sacrificed his own portions to keep them alive. Coach Ek also led the boys in long periods of deep meditation to conserve energy and keep despair from setting in. For a few short hours after the boys' discovery, the world rejoiced that the search had ended successfully. Reality soon set in that getting them out presented a yet more severe challenge. With the only exit still flooded and monsoon season nearing its peak, authorities weighed 3 main options: giving the boys a crash course in cave diving so they could swim out, widening chimneys to allow climbers to pull them out 2,000 feet to the surface, or keeping them alive inside the cave, possibly for months, until the waters receded. But no one seemed to anticipate that the number of divers inside the sealed-off cave was depleting the limited supply of oxygen. When levels dropped to a hazardous 15%, the safe zone typically hovers around 21%, it became clear that the most perilous option, diving, was the only way out. The risks were huge. Cave diving is a highly specialized skill, and those who had contact with the boys said they didn't even know how to swim. Divers said underwater visibility in the jagged tunnels might be only inches. The currents were strong. The water was a chilly 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and the route required being submerged for hours. Some of the passages are so narrow that divers had to remove their equipment to squeeze through. The danger of the mission was underscored on July 6 by the tragic death of a volunteer diver, Petty Officer Sarman Kunan, 38, a retired Thai Navy SEAL, was found unconscious after he had finished his last mission of depositing air tanks for rescuers along the route. Attempts to revive him failed, and he became the rescue's first and ultimately only fatality. Despite the grim setback, speculation mounted among the media massing outside that a rescue was imminent. Each of the boys penned a handwritten letter to their families on mud-stained pages torn from a notebook delivered by divers. "Don't worry, I just disappeared for 2 weeks," wrote Ekarat Bu Wong Suk Chan, 14. "I will hurry out of here." With no parents of his own, Coach Ek wrote an open letter of apology to all the families for putting their sons in danger. They forgave him in a letter reading, "Please don't blame yourself." Today is D-Day, Narong Sak, the mission chief, announced on July 8, 16 days after the boys went missing. Just hours earlier, he had acknowledged that the energy-depleted wild boars were not prepared to dive. But with storm clouds approaching, Narong Sak said conditions would never be better. "We ask everyone to pray and cheer for our success," he said. 13 international divers and 5 Thai SEALs set out on the urgent mission. The boys were moved in groups of 4. One by one, each was sedated to keep them calm, fitted with a full face mask, and tethered to a diver. 2 buddies were assigned to each boy, one hugging him close and weaving his way through an hours-long obstacle course of stalactites, slippery rock, and debris until they reached a SEAL command center in a cavity called Chamber 3. Those who could then walked the next mile to a field hospital where they were examined before being medevaced to the larger Chiang Rai Prachanguro Hospital, where an entire floor was cleared for their arrival. It was an unbelievable and unlikely feat of skill, coordination, and crucially, good luck that the rescue team successfully completed 3 times. When the second batch of 4 boys was marked safe and sound, Narong Sak joked that he had prayed to the rain god Pra Pi Run for a few dry days, "And I got them," he said. Incredibly, all 13 wild boars were plucked from the cave over 3 days, apparently without serious harm. After their ordeal, an official said some of the boys in the hospital asked only for a taste of cow pie krapao, a popular local dish of spicy stir-fried meat with Thai basil. But one boy may return home to find a cake baked to mark his 16 years on Earth. 16 days later, Pirapat Night Sompiangja has something new to celebrate. In the world, democracy will prevail. Mass migration, terrorism, and economic woes are fueling authoritarians around the world. NATO's former Supreme Allied Commander on Why Government of, by, and for the People will win again, by Admiral James Stavridis, retired. I spent much of my early adult life on American warships around the world defending democracy against one of its great 20th century enemies, global communism. The Cold War represented a rare kind of conflict in the span of human civilization, one not between states or princes, but between ideologies. On one side was centralized authoritarian control. On the other, democratic government by, of and for the people. Over the course of the decades-long fight, often carried out in hot proxy wars around the globe, millions of people died, tens of thousands of them Americans. Countries were wiped off the map, and new ones created. It was a high-minded fight with very real human costs. When I came ashore and entered the Naval War College in the fall of 1991, it felt like a struggle of historic significance finally had been won. The Berlin Wall had fallen, and the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. It was a heady time in which democracy seemed to be in full bloom around the world. Later, as a four-star admiral and then as the 16th Supreme Allied Commander of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, I witnessed that expansion firsthand throughout Latin America, the Balkans, and the former Warsaw Pact nations, as once dictatorial nations in South America embraced increasingly free and fair elections, and former communist bloc countries in Eastern Europe joined Western democratic institutions. Was it perfect? Of course not. There was civil war, and authoritarian rulers rose in many nations, but it was exhilarating to watch as millions of people who had lived in fear found greater liberty and economic opportunity. Today, though, one could be forgiven for believing that the age of democracy has ended. Two massive nations, Russia and China, are trending toward one-man rule. The list of countries drifting into autocratic orbits is growing. In Latin America, they include Venezuela, Bolivia, and Nicaragua, which has shown signs of fledgling, if fragile, democracy. On the other side of the Atlantic, Turkey, Hungary, and Poland, still recognizable as democracies, are centralizing power, controlling the media, manipulating the courts, and squelching protest. On the eastern edge of the strategically crucial South China Sea, populist strongman Rodrigo Duterte erodes freedoms in the Philippines. Once again, it seems, democracy has a competitor. Strongmen are rising in part because elected governments are struggling to address new challenges: global migration, technological advances, transnational terrorism, international economic unrest. More and more people are willing to try or tolerate another approach. The yearly Democracy Index, compiled by the Economist Intelligence Unit, registered 2017 as the worst year for global democracy since the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2010, with 3 times as many countries seeing democratic declines as showing increases. In 2006, Freedom House designated 46% of the world's population as living in countries with open political competition, guaranteed civil liberties, strong civil society, and independent media. By 2018, the proportion of those living in such free countries had dropped to 39%. How the remaining members of the free world will respond to this challenge is one of the great questions of the moment. America's President Donald Trump has just met in Brussels with the leaders of the countries of NATO, arguably the most successful military alliance in human history, and Washington's prized partner in democracy's 20th century victory. Throughout his campaign and his presidency, Trump has attacked NATO and American allies in it. From Brussels, he travels to Helsinki, where he will talk privately with Russia's Vladimir Putin, a strong man he has flattered and suggested is to be emulated. Trump himself has shunned traditional norms. His documented falsehoods now number in the thousands, and his rhetoric seeks to chill freedom of the press and undermine the nation's institutions of democracy. Perhaps Trump views his embrace of America's longtime ideological foe as a clever negotiating strategy. Others see a darker future in which political speech is punished, religions are oppressed, and the rights of millions are taken away. Media coverage and recent books underscore the doomsday scenario. from David Runciman's How Democracy Ends to former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's Fascism, a Warning. Writing recently in these pages, my friend and fellow Time contributor Ian Bremmer warns that the greatest threat may be the strong man yet to come. These and other historically literate observers contemplate a future in which democracy has been bested. But it is far too early to lose hope. This is a fight that has been won before and will be won again, even without much help from the White House. While traveling the world for NATO and America's military, I've witnessed key players and movements that will help determine democracy's success. From Colombia to Armenia to Indonesia, often overlooked countries are showing that democracy can meet the challenges of the 21st century better than authoritarianism can. Liberal democracy in its various forms and with its inevitable imperfections is adapting to different cultures and histories and delivering. Human nature is not on authoritarianism's side, nor is history. To begin, we need to know what we're up against. Deep forces are at work. First, democracy is to some extent inherently inefficient. It has always been tempting for nations to avoid the group decision messiness of parliaments, congresses, and assemblies, all the more so today because of the increasing complexity of our globalized society. Mass migrations, terrorism, transnational criminal activity, and international economic upheavals bring a longing for order that can play on false memories of simpler times. That seems to be the driver of creeping authoritarianism in Hungary. During my years at NATO, I met Viktor Orban, the longtime head of that nation's conservative Fidesz party, and a politician of evident dynamism and charisma. As Hungary's prime minister, Orban has used the crisis of migration from the Middle East and Africa to Europe to amass power. He has weakened the courts, the central bank, and the press. In April, he scored a landslide win in parliamentary elections. The same desire for order can be seen driving the rise of Duterte in the Philippines. He has used a national drug crisis to launch widespread extrajudicial killings, that is, state-directed murder. Yet his popularity remains at a stunning 80%. Hunger for order is a powerful force. Second, new technologies are proving to be double-edged swords when it comes to democratic norms. On the one hand, social media and the Internet have enabled democratic revolution. In the Arab Spring, reformers used tools to organize protests and carry messages of change across the Middle East and North Africa. The Internet's massive connectivity is tailor-made for the free exchange of ideas on which democratic rule is based. But of late, it is the dictators, from Moscow to Damascus, who have been more agile and effective in using these tools, spying on opponents at home and abroad, and deploying propaganda in devious new ways. Russia has invested heavily in undermining objective reality by relentlessly sowing doubts online about basic facts. China's leadership not only strictly censors social media, but also employs hundreds of thousands of people to steer online conversation to their liking. The state co-opts political discussion and fabricates posts that extol the Communist Party. Third, the disorienting speed of change has provided an opening for authoritarian leaders who tout their ability to respond rapidly to shifting events. Faster communication, the ability of computers to solve problems that once took weeks or months to crack, and the shrinking news cycle are changing the environment in which government does business. That can give the advantage to one strong voice over the kinds of deliberative committees and blue-ribbon panels that are a mainstay of Western government decision-making. In Turkey, for example, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has promised to use the new wide-ranging executive powers he won in June's elections to rein in the country's double-digit inflation and jumpstart the economy. President Trump himself has mastered the rapid response theatrics of the strongman. He ricocheted from belittling North Korea's Kim Jong-un as a little rocket man to calling him smart and honorable. He wears his inconstancy as a badge of honor, arguing that changing positions allows him to outmaneuver more consistent opponents. Amid rapid change, people want speedy solutions, and democracy is often slow to deliver. But countervailing forces are at work as well. The realities of Russia's nuclear arms and China's rising economic clout, and the fact that neither country has ever had a sustained period of democratic rule, make it easy to forget that the world's dominant military and economic forces remain in the hands of committed democracies. And around the world, many often overlooked nations have been demonstrating that even imperfect democracies can prevail over this century's new challenges. Take India, where over 550 million people voted in the last election, a monumental number. Its democracy is hardly unblemished. Critics say Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, is eroding liberal institutions, and India ranks 138 out of 180 countries in press freedom, according to Reporters Without Borders. But in all of my contacts with senior Indian officials, including members of the military who might be expected to favor top-down order, I have always found an unwavering commitment to democracy. It has assured India decades of stability and growth in the face of terrorist attacks, economic strife, and massive population shifts. Democracy might hardly seem the most efficient response to a half-century's disorder in Colombia, and yet, despite a virulent insurgencies since the mid-1960s, power continues to transfer peacefully in that nation. President Alvaro Uribe gave up the presidency at the end of his constitutionally limited second term in 2010, despite high popularity and calls for him to amend the Constitution to stay on. His successor, Juan Manuel Santos, negotiated a comprehensive but controversial peace agreement with the communist-inspired guerrillas known as FARC, for their formal name's acronym in Spanish. This year, as Santos's second term came to an end, the nation began a heated debate over the peace deal. Democracy provided the answer. An election on June 17 put a stark choice before the people. Ivan Duque, a business-friendly pragmatist who pledged to impose harsher terms on the former rebels, defeated Gustavo Petro, who supported the peace agreement. A nation whose upheaval might easily have led to authoritarianism has again and again chosen free debate and open elections. So it is as well in Brazil, a superpower-sized nation of 200 million that, despite considerable political turmoil, has not turned back towards autocracy. Mexico has just elected Andrés Manuel López Obrador as its president, perhaps not the first choice of the U.S., given his left-leaning agenda, but another example of democracy at work in the third-largest nation in the Americas, swings from right to left following free elections. Technological developments may yet prove a net positive for democracy. I have visited the tiny former Soviet state of Armenia many times and gotten to know the former president and prime minister, Serge Sargsyan. Until recently, he appeared to be an unbeatable authoritarian figure, but weeks of protests powered by the Internet caused him to resign in April and propelled a new leader, Nikol Pashinyan, into power. In Tunisia, the Internet-fueled Arab Spring has persisted. The democratically elected government that replaced the 23-year dictatorship of President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali has remained in power through recurring free and fair elections. Yes, there are worrying trends in the government's responses to media criticism and protests, but the fact that democratic institutions have held up for 7 years is cause for optimism. We paint democracy as a utopia, but it is not. It has been called, as Churchill noted, the worst form of government except for all the others, subject to abuse and manipulation and often sclerotic. We must forgive its failings and work to improve them, as long as its core institutions further civil rights, guarantee rule of law, and are subject to the will of the people. There will be losses in all of these nations, as well as our own: corruption, misbehavior, pressure on the courts and media. Challenges will only grow as change in this century continues at a blistering pace. But for every example of democracy fading out or finding itself under attack, there are counterexamples of democracy and democratic activists moving forward and finding solutions. Under this U.S. administration, there is little leadership on global human rights or democratic norms. But other leaders, from Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron of Europe, to Shinzo Abe of Japan, to Justin Trudeau of Canada, have been outspoken in defense of democratic values. Change is happening in smaller nations as well. And democracy will prevail not because of individual leaders, but because it is better than authoritarianism at meeting the challenges of government. Human nature abhors a boss, and politically, democracy serves as a safety valve. Look to America, even in its current rage. We cannot imagine our own nation without the ability to switch from George W. Bush, a Republican fighting unpopular wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, to Barack Obama, or for that matter to move from Obama to President Trump. Those shifts may look like stark division on the surface, but they also represent democracy's ability to allow dissenting, frustrated views an outlet. Dictators may impose order, but mounting unrest as often as not turns them out, frequently with disastrous results. Some of the worst massacres in modern history have followed the ouster of strong men. We can all hope that the battle to defend democracy will be less costly in the 21st century than in the previous one. We can enhance our chances of winning by empowering women, boosting programs that fight economic inequality, and teaching our children the critical thinking skills they need to separate truth from lies. Democracy's defenders can work to be clear what our cause is, why it matters, and what is at stake. Sometimes people say to me that America is in a war of ideas. Not quite. We remain in a marketplace of ideas. That is what has made us most adaptable to new threats and resilient in the face of challenges. It is also why we must articulate our vision of the values that, while we execute them imperfectly, are right and true. This has been Gene reading from the July 23rd, 2018 issue of Time magazine.
Thank you for listening to the Massachusetts Reading Network, a window to independent life in your community from Cape Cod to the Berkshires.
Hi, this is volunteer reader Peter, it even rhymes, broadcasting from Marshfield, Massachusetts. Stay tuned for more coming your way next.
WRRS Middleborough, Pittsfield, WVBF Middleborough, WDJM Framingham, WUML Lowell, WLLO Londonderry.
Please stay tuned to the Talking Information Center for the Christian Science Monitor. It's coming up next.
Hello, this is Irene, and welcome to the Christian Science Monitor for today. The first story, a Sumatran fishing town's message for Rohingya refugees. Welcome, by Michael Holtz, a staff writer. The plan was to go to Malaysia. That's where 15-year-old Noor Hakim had hoped to reunite with his older brother, who fled Myanmar years ago and has since found work in construction. Noor might have made it there if it weren't for the 2 Thai Navy ships that intercepted the wooden boat he shared with 78 fellow Rohingya refugees. Instead, the Navy escorted the boat towards the Indonesian island of Sumatra. On April 20, after 9 days at sea, it was guided ashore by fishermen and docked at Biruenen, a small fishing town in Aceh province. The town was quick to welcome the refugees. Those who needed medical care were taken to a nearby hospital, and a government training center was turned into a temporary shelter. Volunteers soon arrived to cook meals, give haircuts, and teach Indonesian. A local imam stopped by during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan to offer his prayers. At a time when the West is growing increasingly hostile to refugees, Biruuen residents have taken the opposite tact. Local officials and aid workers, with the support from the International Organization for Migration, IOM, and the United Nations Refugee Agency, have pledged to look after the new arrivals for as long as necessary. We know what they went through in Myanmar, says Mr. Sabarudin, a worker with the Indonesian Red Cross Society, who, like many Indonesians, uses only one name. If not for us, who else would take care for them? Nearly 3 months after their arrival, the 79 Rohingya men, women, and children are still waiting for Indonesian and international authorities to decide their fate. They're happy to have found refuge, but they know that the most Biruuen can offer is a temporary respite from the uncertainty of their lives as citizens of nowhere. The people here have beautiful hearts, Noor says, one morning, after eating a breakfast of steamed white rice and fried noodles. I'm not sure how much longer I'll stay here, but at least for now I know that I'm safe. Search for someplace better. Noor is grateful for his new life in Biruuen, however short his stay may be. Although it isn't the destination for which he risked his death on the high seas, he readily admits it's far better than the place he left behind. The Rohingya, a Muslim minority, have faced intense persecution in Myanmar, a majority Buddhist nation, for decades. Despite origins in the country's Rakhine state, they're considered outsiders and deprived of many civil rights and economic opportunities. The UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights condemned an especially violent period last year as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing and possibly even genocide. For the past 6 years, Noor and his family were forced to live in an internally displaced persons camp after Burmese soldiers burned their home village. His cousin was shot and killed during the attack. Noor was unable to attend school in the camp or go outside to find work. After tensions flared up again last August, his parents pushed him to leave. We have no freedom in Myanmar, says Mohammed Rofik, the captain of the boat that carried Noor to Biruuen. If we stayed there, we would die. The number of refugees from Myanmar, the majority of whom are Rohingya, more than doubled from less than 500,000 at the start of 2017 to 1.2 million by the end of the year, according to the UN Refugee Agency. Most of them now live in overcrowded camps in Bangladesh, but more than 100,000 have packed onto rickety vessels in attempts to cross the Bay of Bengal and Andaman Sea. Hundreds have died along the way. Many boats set sail for Malaysia, where tens of thousands of Rohingya have found work as undocumented laborers. But to get there, they must pass the Isthmus of Thailand. Though once complicit in the region's multi-million-dollar smuggling trade, Thai officials started to crack down after mass graves that held the remains of Rohingya migrants were discovered in 2015. This year, 3 Rohingya boats were apparently pushed away from the Thai coast. In early April, Malaysia authorities intercepted the first boat and took ashore the 56 Rohingya on board. A few days later, off the coast of Aceh, Indonesian fishermen rescued 5 Rohingya left on the second boat. 2 people reportedly died during the 20-day journey, and 8 others jumped overboard in search of land, according to the IOM. Then came Mr. Rofik's boat on April 20. We were expecting more this year, says Miriam Kokhar, the head of IOM office in Medan, a city 250 miles south of Birawem. We were worried about the perilous journey they would take, but so far we haven't heard of anyone making it out again. Brothers and sisters, this year isn't the first time Aceh has welcomed Rohingya refugees. The IOM reports that more than 1,740 have landed in the province over the past decade. In 2015, a wooden boat crammed with nearly 800 Rohingya was towed to the city of Langsa. Fishermen also rescued a smaller boat carrying 47 others about 15 miles south of Langsa that year. Local authorities provided shelter for the refugees in 2 small warehouses. The shelter in Biraweng consists of about half a dozen single-story concrete buildings and a small mosque. 2 of the buildings are being used as separate dormitories for men and women. Another one serves as a logistics center. Inside are sacks of rice and stacks of boxes filled with everything from instant noodles and cooking oil to disposable diapers and toothpaste, much of it donated by local residents. Several local volunteers point to their shared Muslim identity by way of explaining why they have been so hospitable. Aceh is the only province to have formally established Sharia law in Indonesia, a Muslim-majority nation with a relatively secular government. They are our Muslim brothers and sisters, says Muhammad Hussein, a volunteer cook at the camp. It is our duty to look after them. But Mr. Zulfikar, a local official in charge of the camp, maintains that religion has nothing to do with it. Sitting at a table inside the logistics center, he invokes the law of the seas that requires passing boats to try and save a vessel in distress. I don't care if they're Muslim or not, he says. When you see someone who needs help at sea, you don't ask them about their background first, you just help them. Mr. Kolkar says Akanese authorities plan to soon move the refugees 150 miles south to a more permanent shelter in Langsa. Yet few want to stay in Indonesia. Of the 5 that arrived on April 6, 4 have already fled. Kokhar says that they'll likely cross the Strait of Malacca to Malaysia, where they can more easily blend in with the Rohingya who live and work there. Malaysia is still where Noor would like to go in the short term. In preparation, he's been practicing Indonesian, which is closely related to Malay, with aid workers at the camp. He's also been studying English in the hopes of fulfilling an even bigger dream. I want to go to America, Noor says. I heard from my uncle there that people in America are happy. The next story is Riled by Trump's Tariffs, Canadians Get Behind Buy Domestic Movement, by Sarah Miller Lana, staff writer. Mayor Rick Bonnet boasts that his municipality outside Toronto is the most patriotic in all of Canada. On the country's 150th birthday last year, a population of 61,000 raised approximately 57,000 Canadian flags. So, when President Trump slapped aluminum and steel tariffs on his country on the grounds of national security, no less, Mr. Bonnet helped draw up a resolution that passed unanimously by the town council. It encourages Halton Hills residents to become knowledgeable about what they buy and consider avoiding the purchase of U.S. products when possible. We don't want to escalate this, Bonnet says in his sleepy town hall office of the local boycott, but we are not going to be pushed. This has gotten insulting. It is a rare flare-up of passions north of the border that is born not just of antipathy towards American foreign policy, which itself would be nothing new, but something altogether more personal. Amid a trade spat and threats of tariffs on automobiles, peppered by a slew of affronts by President Trump, suddenly Canadians who might have seen the United States as a bully elsewhere in the world now feel that they are the kid getting picked on. A hashtag Buy Canadian movement has become their pushback. Canadians are certainly not alone, as Trump has lambasted allies in recent weeks from Germany to Britain, while seemingly to cozy up to America's traditional folds, as he did in Helsinki with Russia's Vladimir Putin this week. But a growing rift threatens the relationship between arguably the two closest countries in the world, and that relationship has worked precisely because it has long been based on local connections and the task at hand. Politics and personalities don't get in the way. A lot of the cooperation that goes on between Canada and the United States is functional, says Robert Wolfe, professor emeritus at Queen's University. It is not because we love each other, it is because we share a continent. Can that survive a sustained period of political turbulence at the top? I don't know. We've never had sustained turbulence at the top, so we don't know what would happen. A significant wedge. Canada and the United States have taken divergent paths as far back as the American Revolution. In the modern era, disputes over softwood lumber or lobsters over the Vietnam and Iraq wars have strained the relationship. But differences have always been managed quietly and kept narrow in favor of constructive cooperation. Much of that has been achieved by delegating responsibilities to commissions and creating pacts, whether on water quality of the Great Lakes or airspace control under the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, says Christopher Sands, director of the Center for Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Washington. When Trump leaves the scene, the relationship will need some healing, he says. We'll have to have a decision about whether we want to continue to use institutions to take politics out of the relationship on a day-to-day basis, or whether the answer is going to be reinforcing our national sovereignties. A divergence under Trump was to be expected. One survey ahead of the American election in 2016 showed 80% of Canadians saying they would vote for Hillary Clinton if they could. But the frontal attacks coming from Washington on trade have driven a significant wedge. Then, Trump abandoned the niceties that have long marked the public relationship between both nations' leaders after he called Prime Minister Justin Trudeau weak and dishonest, leaving the Group of Seven summit in Charlevoix, Quebec last month. The spat comes to the U.S., Canada, and Mexico are in talks to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Canadian leadership always has to strike a careful balance between not caving to American interests, but maintaining privileged access to Washington. But even in a polarized country with 2009 elections looming, Canadians across the spectrum rallied around $12.6 billion in retaliatory tariffs, announced by Trudeau's government, giving the Liberal leader a welcome bump in the polls. According to a survey by Abacus Data in June, only 19% of Canadians opposed counter tariffs. One Canadian publication published a Patriot's Guide to Shopping during a Canada-U.S. trade war, with such suggestions as foregoing Hershey factory products and opting for Canadian chocolate brand Laura Secord, named after a heroine of the War of 1812 who warned British troops of an impending American attack. The Union, Unifor, launched its own boycott campaign. Canadians have shared stories about canceling vacations in New York or the American West for Prince Edward Island or the Canadian Rockies. This is not a game. At a Metro supermarket in Halton Hills, Maureen Soden says she no longer will buy toilet paper made in the United States and has done her research about where her products come from, or at least as much as possible in such an integrated market. She says this locally soured movement is a good locally sourced movement is a good consciousness-raising exercise, even if it's hardly an economic threat to the U.S. We are so close, it is as if everything just becomes part of the Americas. But we are distinct, she says, and we're becoming more and more distinct. That is a sentiment that has increasingly come to the fore. The economic trade between the countries totaled $673.9 billion last year, with a U.S. surplus of $8.4 billion. Canada is much more dependent on what it sells to the U.S. than vice versa. Diversification, whether with China or the European Union, is shaped by that reality. It is impossible to see a world for Canada in which the United States is not the predominant relationship, says Drew Fagan, a professor of public policy at the University of Toronto. Yet he notes a growing divide between the U.S. and Canada since 9/11, both physically on the border and in terms of a values gap, after decades of a trend towards deeper integration. Mayor Burnett has felt the divide too. He first took a public stand in 2009, criticizing Buy American policies implemented under the former President Barack Obama. But the Trump era has changed basic assumptions that could threaten the long-term relationship, Bonnet says. Things have just gone so sideways, he says. There's a lot of theories that the president has ramped this up for the midterms, and if that's the case, I hope at the end of the day that common sense prevails, that we go back to being the good trading partners we always were. But this is not a game, and anyone who lost a job over this is going to feel resentful for a long time. The next story is Australia's polarizing policy deters migrants, leaves many in limbo, by Rod McGurk of the Associated Press. When Abdul Aziz reached Australia's Christmas Island aboard a smuggler's boat in 2013, he had no idea that weeks earlier his fate as a refugee from Sudan seeking a new life in a new world had been sealed. Australia drew a line in the sand on July 19 of that year to stem a rising tide of asylum seekers brought by smugglers on long and treacherous ocean voyages. No refugees who attempted to reach its shores by boat from that date forward would be allowed to make Australia their home. 5 years later, the polarizing policy, lauded as a template for other countries and condemned as a cruel abrogation of Australia's international obligations, appears to have succeeded as a deterrent. Near daily arrivals from Indonesian ports of rickety fishing boats have virtually stopped. But what to do with the hundreds of asylum seekers banished by Australia to sweltering immigration camps in the poor Pacific Island nations of Papua New Guinea and Nauru is gaining urgency. The simplest way for me to describe it is it's just like hell, Mr. Aziz told the Associated Press by phone from an immigration hostel in a Papua New Guinea village. He hopes to be among the 1,250 refugees barred by Australia that President Trump has reluctantly agreed to accept as a part of a deal struck between Australia and the Obama administration. You send people to a place, and you want those people to either die or go back to where they came from, even if the place is very, very dangerous, Aziz said. He described a growing sense of hopelessness and fear of hostile villagers among the asylum seekers, some of whom are mute with despair. Daniel Webb, director of Australia's Human Rights Law Centre, told the UN Human Rights Council last month that Nauru's refugee population included 134 children, 40 who were born there. The number dropped to 124 by this week after some children were sent to Australia for medical treatment and others to the United States for resettlement. With every anniversary, with every birthday, and with every death, the sense of hopelessness and sheer exhaustion in these island prisons rises, Mr. Webb said on Wednesday. Our government just can't imprison them forever. Australia offers to pay thousands of dollars to asylum seekers who agree to go home, and many have taken up the offer rather than languish in limbo. Australia has also a multi-million-dollar deal with Cambodia to accept refugees who agree voluntarily to leave Nauru and Papua New Guinea. Few have accepted that offer. New Zealand offered to resettle 150, but successive Australian governments have declined, fearing it might become a backdoor for the exiled refugees to enter Australia. The tense island camps have seen riots, murders, suicides, and escalating mental illness. The Australian government reached a settlement of $68 million with 1,905 asylum seekers last year who sought compensation for alleged physical and psychological suffering while they were confined in Papua New Guinea. Australia blames the asylum seekers for their plight. The government believes they stay in the islands mistakenly, thinking Australia will eventually relent and let them in. It's happened before. When Norwegian fighter MV Tampa rescued 433 Afghan asylum seekers in 2001 from a sinking Indonesian fishing boat and attempted to deliver them to the nearest port, Christmas Island, Australia sent Special Forces troops to stop the ship. The Tampa was sent to Nauru under a newly imposed Australian policy of keeping asylum seekers from its coast that became known as the Pacific Solution. Conservative Prime Minister John Howard was re-elected weeks later in a campaign that focused on his tough stance on asylum seekers. Boat arrivals slowed for a few years as Australian-funded detention camps grew on Nauru and Papua New Guinea. A few countries took some refugees off Australia's hands. In the end, Australia quietly accepted the last several hundred refugees. A new center-left Labour Party government closed the Nauru camp in February of 2008 when the final 21 Sri Lankan refugees were flown to Australia. Papua New Guinea camps had closed years earlier. When the boats started coming back in 2012, it was a Labour government that reopened the camps on Nauru and Papua New Guinea. Weeks before a 2013 election, Labour Prime Minister Kevin Rudd declared that asylum seekers who come here by boat without a visa will never be settled in Australia. Andrew Marcus, a Monash University expert on immigration, says studies show a majority of Australians support the government's tough refugee policy. He believes it's politically impossible for a government to resettle the island refugees in Australia now. They've really painted themselves into a corner, Mr. Marcus said of the promise that boat arrivals would never be accepted. Some are still trying. The government disclosed this week that it turned 33 asylum seekers' boats back to Indonesia over the past 5 years. The U.S. promised to accept up to 1,250 refugees will not settle the futures of all. According to the Human Rights Watch Law Center, there are almost 800 asylum seekers in the male-only facilities in Papua New Guinea, and almost 900 men, women, and child asylum seekers in Nauru. More than 400 have gone to Australia for medical attention or to support sick relatives and have appealed to the courts to prevent being forced to return to the islands, the human rights group said. Aziz, the refugee on Papua New Guinea, believes the asylum seekers are victims of Australian politics. I believe no matter how long we spend on this island, we're not going to go to Australia, Aziz said. What do you expect from this government? Do you expect that this government at the end of the day will say, okay, we surrender, okay, we give up, and these people, they won't. That's not going to happen, he said. The next story is from the USA section. The title is Overturning Roe Might Be Simple. The Politics That Follow Won't Be, by Jessica Mendoza, a staff writer. With the U.S. Supreme Court poised to side further to the political right if President Trump's nominee is confirmed, the end of Roe v. Wade era suddenly seems a very real possibility. Roe, the 1973 ruling that legalized abortion in the U.S., has been at the heart of a heated culture war that split the nation largely along partisan lines. Almost as soon as the decision was made, anti-abortion activists began working toward a high court roster that would reverse the ruling. Judge Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation, if it goes through in the fall, would give them their most conservative and most promising lineup in decades. But if Roe is overturned, what then? Would America be flung back into the age of back alleys or forward into a Handmaid's Tale dystopia, as some abortion rights advocates fear? If the Supreme Court does overturn Roe or substantially weakens it, which is what many experts are predicting will happen, it would send abortion policy back to state legislatures to hash out. Already, even with Roe in place, more than 400 abortion restrictions have been passed at the state level over the past half-decade. Without Roe, some states would likely see an uptick of those restrictions, resulting in a wider gap between states in terms of access to safe, legal abortions, policy experts say. Reproductive rights advocates are already calling for all hands on deck in preparing for the worst. But legislating, particularly when it comes to a controversial issue like abortion, is rarely a straightforward or simple process. While 4 states have trigger laws in place that would automatically ban abortion as soon as Roe is overturned, many others would need lawmakers to introduce and vote on new abortion bills and update their existing statutes. Some legal analysts say that when push comes to shove, legislators, especially in swing states or in states with divided government, may not relish having to codify their rhetorical positions into concrete laws and regulations. Up until now, state legislators could duck this controversial social issue and say to whomever they're talking to, whether they're pro-choice or pro-life, I agree with you, but there's nothing I can do about it because the Supreme Court has taken it out of my hands, says Dwight Duncan, a professor at the University of Massachusetts School of Law in Dartmouth. If Roe v. Wade was undone, the issue is back in their ballpark, and they no longer have that excuse. The politics change, he says. Not only will state representatives be forced to tackle the myriad and complex details of abortion policy, but they'll likely be doing it with advocates on both sides rallying voters around the issue. Some say that's a good thing. Policies set by the legislative branch as opposed to the judiciary tend to be perceived as more legitimate because they reflect the will of the people. We're a democratic republic, and we the people ultimately should be the rulers. To the extent that it's unelected people in robes deciding these questions, we the people are essentially left out of this, Professor Duncan says. It could also scramble the nation's political divide in unexpected ways. The fulfillment of such a long-held conservative goal-overturning Roe could potentially deprive the Republican Party of what for decades has been a top motivating issue for many of its voters. Anti-Roe sentiment is a combination of two things: a sincere hostility to abortion and sexual freedom, combined with the argument that this ruling is rammed down the public's throats by unelected, life-tenured lawyers, says Eric Siegel, a professor at Georgia State University College of Law in Atlanta, who wrote a book on the Supreme Court. The second argument goes away once Roe gets overturned. Others suspect that a reversal on Roe could spur a fierce reaction from liberals that would mirror the rise of Christian conservatives as a political powerhouse after 1973. That could be the kind of energizing force needed to create a backlash on the left, thus energizing the Democratic Party, says Mark Kendi, director of the Drake Constitutional Law Center in Des Moines, Iowa. Still, without the Supreme Court protecting a woman's right to decide whether or not to have an abortion, reproductive rights activists worry that many states will reverse what they see as decades of progress, especially for women in poor and rural communities. Already since 2011, 33 states have enacted a total of 420 policies restricting abortion, according to the Guttmacher Institute, a reproductive rights research group. What we've seen in the past 8 years has been devastating to abortion rights, says Elizabeth Nash, a policy analyst for the Washington-based nonprofit. Without those Supreme Court protections, these restrictions will proliferate. Yet even then, analysts say, it's unlikely America would see a reversion to the worst of the pre-Roe era in terms of a rise in unsafe alternatives. Medical abortions, which take the form of pills, offer an option beyond what is available to women in the 50s and 60s, though of course no one wants to encourage women to resort to illegal means. That's shabby use of law to say, well, you can also get an illegal pill, says Carol Sanger, a professor at Columbia Law School in New York. Women today also have more political power, which means that any abortion restrictions that surface after a reversal on Roe would likely face more challenges. While certainly not all women are pro-abortion rights, they have been the main drivers of the reproductive rights movement. And whatever abortion restrictions may be passed after Roe is overturned may not be the final word, says Professor Sanger, who also wrote the book about abortion, Terminating Pregnancy in 21st Century America. Given enough opposition, laws can be lobbied against and repealed. I can imagine someone introducing a bill saying, "This law doesn't work. We haven't thought it through enough," she says. We're going to see some really interesting politics going on, Sanger adds. It's much harder to take a right away than instill a new one. Next from the USA section is Immigrant Children Describe Detention Conditions by Amy Taxon of the Associated Press. Wet and muddy from their trek across the Mexican border, immigrant children say they sat or lay on the cold concrete floor of the immigration holding centers where they were taken. It was hard to sleep with lights shining all night and guards kicking their feet, they say. They were hungry after being given what they say were frozen sandwiches and smelly food. Younger children cried in caged areas where they were crammed in with teens, and they clamored for their parents. Toilets were filthy and running water was scarce, they say. They waited unsure and frightened of what the future might bring. I didn't know where my mother was, said Griselda, 16, of Guatemala, who entered the United States with her mother in the McAllen, Texas area. I saw girls ask where their mothers were, but the guards would not tell them. The children's descriptions of various facilities are part of a voluminous and at times scathing report filed in federal court this week in Los Angeles in a case over whether the Trump administration is meeting its obligations under a long-standing settlement government how young migrants should be treated in custody. Dozens of volunteer lawyers, interpreters, and other legal workers fanned out across the Southwest in June and July to interview more than 200 immigrant parents and children in holding facilities, detention centers, and a youth shelter. Advocates said the government isn't complying with the decades-old Flores Agreement, which lays out detention conditions and release requirements for immigrant children. They have spoken out loud and clear, and what they've said is they are experiencing enforced hunger, enforced dehydration, enforced sleeplessness, said Peter Shea, an attorney for the children who has asked the court to appoint a special monitor to enforce the agreement. They are terrorized, and I think it is time for the courts and the public to hear their voices. The Department of Homeland Security, which oversees immigration and border enforcement, did not immediately comment. But in their own reports to the court last month, government monitors said that immigration authorities were complying with the settlement agreement. In his report, Henry Moak, Jr., Juvenile Coordinator for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, documented the air temperature as appropriate at a number of border facilities and said he drank the water himself from 5-gallon containers at a processing center in McAllen. He said some children and parents told them they disliked the food and weren't sure the water was drinkable, but there were no allegations the food was spoiled. At the Yuma station in Arizona, he said he tried the water there too, and I can confirm the water fountains worked and the water tasted clean. The litany of complaints compiled by advocates comes after a global outcry drove the Trump administration to stop separating immigrant families at the border. Authorities are now reuniting parents and children under a separate court order and said they will seek to detain families together during their immigration proceedings. Though under the Flores Agreement, immigrant children are generally supposed to be released from custody in about 20 days. In that case, Justice Department lawyers assured a judge this week that the children in government custody were being well cared for. Many of the children described conditions in the U.S. Customs and Border Protection facilities, where they were taken and processed in the initial days after crossing the border. They were identified in the reports solely by their first names. Timofey, a 15-year-old from Russia, who sought asylum at the border with his parents over the beliefs as Jehovah's Witnesses, said night and day blended together in the locked, crowded room where he was held with other boys. It had a single window overlooking an empty corridor, he said. He said there was no soap in the bathroom, and he only sometimes got a single-use toothbrush. He said he was offered a shower upon arriving at the San Ysidro, California facility, but didn't take one and wasn't allowed one on his second or third day there. Some children were later sent to the Casa Padre shelter in Texas for immigrant children traveling alone or who were separated from their parents. The facility operates under a contract with the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. There, teenage boys described going hungry and not being given enough time to speak with their parents by phone. Kenneth Wolf, a spokesman for HHS's Administration for Children and Families, said the agency wouldn't comment on specific cases, but if a contractor doesn't comply with agency procedures, the issue is addressed. Also in Texas, Kaylin, a 16-year-old girl from Honduras, said she traveled north with her mother after her mother's life was threatened back home. The pair turned themselves in at the border near McAllen and were taken to a facility she called the Icebox because it was so cold. A day later, they were taken to a facility with caged areas she called the Doghouse. There, they were separated and allowed to speak once for 10 minutes over the next 4 days. In both places, the food was frozen and smelled bad, and she couldn't eat it, she said. She said female guards yelled at her and other girls, made them strip naked, and leered at them before they showered. I was very frightened and depressed the entire time. I was scared of the guards and scared I would be deported without my mother, she said, adding they were later reunited and sent to a family detention center. Angel, a 13-year-old girl who came from Mexico, Angel, a 13-year-old who came from Mexico with his mother, said guards told boys in his cell in McAllen they were going to be adopted and wouldn't see their parents again. He was later sent to family detention with his mother, where he said they passed an asylum screening and were awaiting release. I'm excited to get out of here and get past this nightmare, he said. The next article is a commentary by Joan Bernard Bradley. Angels That Keep Us Safe. For many years, traveling between countries was a big part of my life. I live on the North American mainland, and my parents lived in the Caribbean, so I traveled frequently to visit them. When I was a new student of Christian Science, a member of the church I'd begun attending took an interest in my travels and often engaged me in conversations about them. At one point, she lovingly asked me if preparations for my trips included prayers for safety. When I said they did not, she reminded me of the many examples in the Bible of people who relied successfully on God to keep them safe. Deeply moved by this woman's love and care for my welfare, I began to study some Bible stories with safety in mind. In particular, the story of Moses stood out. The great Hebrew leader defied a Pharaoh's powerful army by leading the people who had been enslaved in Egypt to freedom. He did this by relying entirely on God's guidance and protecting care. I especially loved this verse from later in the story when the group was making its way through the wilderness. Behold, I send an angel before thee, to keep thee in the way, and to bring thee into the place which I have prepared. Exodus 23:20. This message must have reassured Moses and conveyed the idea that God's loving presence was a wise and intelligent force for good that he could rely on to help the Israelites on their journey. This got me to thinking about the idea of angels, and soon I found an enlightening definition of angels in Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Monitor founder Mary Baker Eddy. It reads, God's thoughts passing to man, spiritual institutions pure and perfect, the inspiration of goodness, purity, and immortality, counteracting all evil, sensuality, and mortality. For me, this radically different concept of angels was meaningful and practical. Christian Science explains that another name for God is mind, and the divine mind provides